Hey there, Scaling Up Nation. Trace Blackmore here, and I've got something that'll revolutionize your approach to risk management. McGowan Insurance Group. They're not just another insurance broker, they're your strategic partners in safeguarding your water treatment business. Imagine this, a team of experts who truly get our industry, offering a full spectrum of services from property and casualty to employee benefits and even 401k administration. They're licensed in all 50 states, so wherever you're treating water, they've got your back. But here's the real kicker. McGowan doesn't just sell policies, they forge exceptional client experiences. They'll deep dive into your operations, craft a customized risk analysis, and even evaluate your risk management program. So Scaling Up Nation, if you're ready to take your risk management to new heights, reach out to the industrial water treatment team at McGowan. Head over to scalinguph2o.com/McGowan to find out more. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/McGowan. McGowan Insurance Group. Start forging your path to better protection today. Your system deserves the best, and so do you. Thermal Fluid Technologies brings you Protocol heat transfer fluids. Formulated with their innovative no-pit inhibitors designed to keep your systems efficient and corrosion-free. Whether it's HVAC, food processing, or beverage applications, their glycol-based solutions deliver reliability where it matters most. Plus, with their comprehensive coolant testing program, you can rest assured knowing your system is always operating at its best. Discover the difference by going to scalinguph2o.com/TFT. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/TFT. Thermal Fluid Technologies, where performance meets peace of mind. Welcome to the Scaling Up H2O podcast, the podcast where we scale up on knowledge so we don't scale up our systems. My name is Trace Blackmore, the host of the Scaling Up H2O podcast. And Nation, it was so cool last week to see so many of you at the Association of Water Technologies technical training seminars in Frisco, Texas. And yes, if you're wondering, I did go to Hard 8, one of my favorite barbecue restaurants. I actually saw a couple of Scaling Up Nation members there devouring some amazing Q with me. So just once again, thanks for coming up, saying hi, and you get a chance to do this again next year. AWT hasn't put the calendar out for next year, but if you didn't get a chance to go, make sure you listen to this podcast, because as soon as I hear that hits the calendars, I will let you know so you can get registered. Also, it is the beginning of the second quarter. It seems like just yesterday we were celebrating New Year's, and now we are graduating Q1 and we are going into Q2. Now, it's my hope that you all keep score in quarters. There's just something about keeping all your goals on track and validating if you're on track or off track, what metrics you have around those on the quarter system. I know some people that have yearly goals, and you should have yearly goals, but you should break those yearly goals down into quarterly parts, so that way you have 4 different sections that you have to complete in order to get to those annual goals. And what that allows you to do is not procrastinate through the entire year. And then Thanksgiving comes around and you think, oh my gosh, I only have another month to get this annual goal accomplished. So by changing your thinking to 90-day goals each and every quarter, one, it's a more bite-sized piece and it makes it more manageable for you to tackle your goals. It also allows you more down-to-earth metrics that you can gauge yourself by, and it gives you 4 opportunities to learn what life is trying to teach you. Am I trying to take on too much? Am I not taking on enough? Am I not taking in consideration all of these things that are going on in my life? Well, if we waited to the end of the year to do that, we're not going to be able to utilize that at all. But by doing that each and every quarter, you get to advance every quarter by what the previous quarter taught you. So it's my hope that that's how you're planning. And it's only the second quarter. If you haven't done that, you're still got plenty of quarter left or quarters left. So why not start that in the beginning of Q2? And Nation, if you want to learn more about this method, it's one that I've adopted from the 12-week year. So if you want to learn more about the 12-week year, well, maybe you listen to that on Audible, and I can get you a free book and a free month by going to scalinguph2o.com/audible. And maybe the 12-week year can be the first book that you get. Or maybe you want a hard copy of that book. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of cool graphs and charts and all sorts of stuff. I did both. I listened to it and I also got the hard copy. Well, we have an affiliate link for you on that book. It's scalinguph2o.com/12-week year. So /12-week year. You still got plenty of year left. I encourage you to get to business, to start taking into account your quarter strategy this quarter in Q2. Well, speaking of some other things that are coming up in Q2, the American Waterworks Association is having their annual conference and expo in Denver, Colorado, June 8th through 11th. Also, the Water Environment Federation is holding their joint conference on residuals, biosolids, and innovations in treatment technology in Baltimore, Maryland, May 6th through 9th. We'll have all of that information for you on our events page. And then finally, the 5th Annual Oilfield Water Markets Conference is taking place May 6th through 7th in Irvine, Texas. And we'll have that information for you and so much more by going to scalinguph2o.com/events, where you can read everything that we know about coming up in our industry. Now, maybe you know about something that you don't see on our site. We want to know about that. So if that is something that you've got this secret conference that no one else knows about, or at least we don't know about it, go to scalinguph2o.com, go over to our show ideas page, let us know about that, and we will get that on there. My team is doing such an amazing job trying to get all of the water-related conferences and the like on our events page, because this job is hard. And trying to find all of these things in one place, it did not exist before Scaling Up H2O and my amazing team. So if you know something that we can add to that page, that will just help us help you, and we would be very appreciative for that. You know, somebody we are very appreciative for is our friend James McDonald, and here is a brand new installment on What Do You Know?
Hello and welcome to What Do You Know? The game show where we find out what do you know about industrial water treatment, drop by drop. So pump up your brain, take out that test kit of knowledge, and prepare to answer this week's question on What Do You Know? Today's question is, what is the process called to evaluate the performance and efficiency of a water softener by taking regeneration water samples, measuring their salinity, and interpreting their results? It is called an elution study. When a water softener is not behaving as expected, performing an elution study is often a relatively easy step to take to help diagnose the problem. I'm James McDonald, and thanks for playing along with us. Stay tuned for next week's episode of What Do You Know?
Scaling Up Nation, as I have always said, Pinks and Blues episodes are my favorite because that means I am answering your direct requests. I'm talking about the things that you've asked me to talk about. But that being said, most of our guests are now coming from Scaling Up Nation members that say we need to interview a particular person, or I have a particular topic. So you guys just do a great job of that. And I've said this before, but there's a show out there called Dirty Jobs, and it actually came back. I think it's in its 11th season now. It took a little break. It's with Mike Rowe. He is one of my favorite TV personalities. I just love his voice. He does a lot of voiceover work. Anyway, when he started Dirty Jobs, which is a show about how do we make sure we have the right content on that people want to watch, and then how do we show what the unsung heroes of society are actually doing to make society palatable, hence Dirty Jobs. He had a great run the first season, and then they were 100% out of ideas. And he realized very quickly that if he did not rely on the audience to help him out with future ideas, they would not have a show. And as I mentioned, they took a little break off, but now I think they're filming season 11. And it's all because of listeners like yourself, or viewers in his case, writing in and letting him know, hey, we've got this job that you probably have never heard about. What do you think about coming to film that? And they still have content that they are doing. Well, I learned from him that we had lots of ideas, but if we did not get help from you, I didn't know how long those ideas were going to last. So thank you to everybody that allowed this episode to be possible. So I'm going to do this episode a little bit differently. In the past, I've recorded some of your questions and played them on the air, or I've read some of the questions on the air that you all have written in. But what I'm going to do with this is I've taken multiple questions that you all have had, and I have crafted an entire show out of that content. And specifically, what we are talking about today is phosphate. Now, if you are a long-term listener of the Scaling Up H2O podcast, you know that we have already done a show on phosphate. It's episode 46. It originally aired August 31st of 2018. Now, if you know that, you are a super fan. But there were a lot of people that wrote in that asked me to do a phosphate show that I don't think they knew that there was already a show on phosphate. That's okay because it's one of my favorite topics. I find that phosphate is one of those things that we all test for, and not everybody understands truly what it is, what it does, what the tests are around it. They just are following a set of procedures. So it's my hope today to go back and revisit things that we've talked about and maybe some things that we didn't from episode 46 and do another phosphate episode. Now, 46, that's almost 400 episodes in between the last time we did a show devoted to phosphate. So I think that it is time, and based on all of the inquiries that I got around phosphate, I am pretty sure that this is going to be a welcome topic. Now, talking about episode 46, I geeked out on phosphate. And since that time, there have been some updates and things that are being looked at, and some updates that I am going to do in this episode that might be a little slightly different from the last episode. I don't think any of that information's wrong. We just have better ways of explaining things. But I am not going to cover every single thing that I did in episode 46. So here is my advice. I think it's a good idea if you go back and listen to episode 46. It is not a prerequisite by any stretch, but I think it will give you a bigger understanding, a larger understanding is probably a better way of saying that, for this episode. And again, I'm not going to go over every single thing that I went over with in episode 46. But I do want to call out episode 46 a little bit more because episode 46 was a special episode. It was a highly technical episode, and it was where I was trying to describe things that if I did not do well, I was going to lose everybody. So as far as first, it was one of the first times I took a highly technical topic and tried to describe it in the mind's eye of everybody that was listening. And I think that show was pretty successful because from that, we learned how to do even more of these pinks and blues episodes. It was also the first time that I shared a science experiment with you. Now, back in that episode, I talked specifically about a device that we use for UV digestion called the SteriPen. And back in 2018, there was a lot of conversation on something that we don't even use anymore. It was called the listserv about people weren't getting repeatable results. So I actually did an experiment that I explain in episode 46 on how I could prove that that device was absolutely perfectly fine for digesting phosphate and azole samples, I will add. It was also the very first episode that we introduced multiple tracks into one podcast. Now, what I mean by that is we recorded two guests on episode 46, and those two guests were not together. They were separate recordings, and then we brought them into the same podcast. Now, we've done that several times since then, but that was the first time we ever did it, was episode 46. And then the other fun thing is it was the first time on episode 46 that we mentioned the scaling up H2O buttons. A year prior to episode 46, I was at the AWT convention and we started giving out the scaling up H2O buttons, and they were a smash hit. Well, in preparation for the upcoming AWT event back in 2018, I was letting people know that we had more buttons for them and to hopefully come up and ask for them. Well, I was overwhelmed by the amount of people that came up and asked for the scaling up H2O buttons. And that now has become a tradition to every technical conference that I go to. Now, I normally promote it at the AWT conference, but if you see me somewhere, chances are I am going to have some buttons to give you. We just have so many here. I want to make sure that we are going through our stock, and they don't do any good sitting in a box here in our office. They do a lot better work when they are with you to remind you of your favorite water treatment podcast. So that was the first episode that I ever mentioned those buttons. By the way, I mentioned this on the last episode of last year. We actually gave out 20 pounds of buttons at last year's AWT conference. Now, you might say, Trace, how many was that actually? I need to weigh that to see what that was. I know it's 20 pounds because my bag was 20 pounds lighter. And the only difference from when I flew to the event and when I came back was there were less buttons in that bag, 20 pounds less. So there you go. Those are some first with episode 46. And again, I'm going to encourage you to go back and listen to episode 46 as you listen to this episode. So this episode, just like 46, is all about phosphate. And I'm going to start from the basics. Phosphates are an anion that are primarily derived from phosphoric acid or something like that. The most common form is orthophosphate, and we write that as PO4. Specifically, it's 3 PO4s. Now, if you were to look at how that's drawn, there's 4 oxygens that are bonded to the phosphorus, and one of those oxygens is double bonded to the phosphorus. So that's what that looks like. Now, there's all sorts of different terminology around phosphate. So I'm going to mention 3 because a lot of times we will use words interchangeably, and they're not necessarily interchangeable. So phosphate is exactly what I just mentioned. That's that 3 times PO4. Now, phosphorus, however, is the elemental form of P, phosphorus. So there we go. If you look at the periodic table, that is phosphorus. And then there's another term out there called phosphate. phosphorus, and that's just say it's related to phosphorus. All right. Hopefully, I didn't confuse everybody, but I've heard those terms being used interchangeably. And now you know specifically what each one of those terms means and how to use that. So, why is phosphate important? Well, quite simply, we could not function in our bodies without phosphates. It's one of the primary components in our DNA and our RNA. And we're normally testing something called adenosine triphosphate. Well, folks, the initial component in that is phosphate, triphosphate. So there you go. We can't have strong teeth and bones without phosphate. We're not able to signal from our brains to the different parts of our bodies without phosphate. So, phosphate allows for our cell membranes to do the things that they need to do. So, our body is very dependent on phosphates. Now, in industry, phosphates are used in fertilizers. If you're looking at the fertilizers, there's three numbers that tell you the strength of the fertilizer. One of those numbers is the phosphorus that is in that compound. It's in food additives, cosmetics, it's in animal feed. It's utilized in detergents and cleaning agents. And of course, why you tuned in today, it is widely used in the industrial water treatment industry. So, with that, when we talk about phosphate based treatments, we can use this as a corrosion and scale inhibitor. And I'm primarily going to use the cooling scenario to talk about phosphates further. Now, if you want to apply another type system, feel free to do that. But we only have so much time on the show, so I'm going to keep my commentary around cooling. Now, one of the primary things that it does is it provides corrosion control. So, in conditions in cooling water, they reduce the potential for the metal to generally corrode. Now, they also provide some scale prevention. So, if we're talking about organic phosphates, or I might say phosphonates, I'll talk more about that a little bit later. We're using those to primarily control calcium carbonate scaling. Now, one of the ways that that can help with that is threshold inhibition. And that's where we can actually extend the amount of calcium that can be held in the system without coming out of solution. And with all the different metallurgies and all the different things that we've got to account for in the system, when it comes to corrosion inhibitors and scale inhibitors, phosphates are probably one of the most versatile that we can use when we take all of that into consideration. Now, there's no free lunch in anything we do in water treatment. So if we're getting good results on one side, we're going to have to look at some potential bad things that we can control on the other. And the number one thing I would say is that we have, I don't know, I want to say bug growth, but that's a very lax term. So we're going to get more biological growth within the system because remember that fertilizer we talked about earlier? Well, folks, we are feeding things, and that's giving food to all the potential things that can grow in the system. So typically with phosphate, and I want to say with any system in cooling, you got to make sure that you have your microbial program dialed in. And especially since we are feeding a food into the system, we'll know that's not the primary reason we're feeding that in there, but we need to know that we are measuring the right things so we are delivering the right portions of microbicide. Also, there could be some environmental concerns. So, depending where your system is discharging, they may have some limitations on how much phosphorus that you can send to the municipality or wherever that water is going. So, make sure you know not only what's going into your system, but what's coming out of your system and where that water is going. If you don't know that, you need to ask your customer. And if they don't know it, you could have some issues. So find out before somebody comes knocking at the door and delivers you an issue. Also, precise control is a must. If we are not keeping track of how much of the different components of phosphate are in the system, what temperatures those phosphates are actually traveling over, what the concentration is, all of these various things. If we're not keeping up with that, it really could be disastrous in the form of calcium phosphate fouling. Now, calcium phosphate fouling is where the calcium and the phosphate are coming together, especially in higher temperatures. You've heard me say before, we are heat transfer efficiency managers. That implies heat, and that implies areas that will reduce the amount of solubility for calcium phosphate. Now, one of the most demonstrative things that I can remember my father doing when I was just learning this industry is we were cleaning up a system that had calcium phosphate scale. And there was a big chunk of it. And I remember my dad picked it up and he threw it at a cinder block wall. So this concrete wall, and it dented the concrete wall. It did not do anything to that calcium phosphate chunk that he threw at it. So that's just meant to show me and now you, through your mind's eye, how put together and how hard it is to clean that stuff up. And the message that he was trying to tell me is it's much easier to keep a system clean, not scaled, than it is to clean up a scaled system. In this particular system, we were acid cleaning it to try to dissolve out all that calcium phosphate. Now, if I recall correctly, this was not an account that we messed up. We had taken the account over from some previous person that messed up. We were acid cleaning that, and we were trying to get good heat transfer from the heat exchanger that they were getting very poor heat transfer. And that was one of my first acid cleanings, if I remember, and we were successful, and the customer was ecstatic. It's always good when you know what the problem is and you can fix it, clean it up, but then you know how to make sure to run the program of the future that doesn't recreate that issue. And I assure you, after it was cleaned up, we did not recreate that issue. I don't know who has that account this many years later. That's in another state that I do not live in anymore. But hopefully it's clean and running very sound. Now, because of those issues that I just mentioned with phosphate, there are some people that are afraid to use it. And there are plenty of technologies out there that you can use that are phosphate-free or alternative chemistries. Now, with that, phosphate works amazingly well. So if you can find a reason to use something else, maybe there's a great reason for that. But that just goes to show you, you need to know your product line. And if you don't know your product line, there may be a better product out there that you should be using that you don't know about. And maybe that product is better for that account and it's more cost effective. But because you don't know about it, you're not using the best product that you could be using. So I encourage all of you to talk with people in your company or to look at your product catalogs and see all the products that are available to you. Look at your product data sheets and make sure that you understand those. If you have a technical person in your company, and I am sure that you do, ask questions about certain products. And like I said, you might find a better choice from what you are using now. Now, back in episode 46, I talked about the different types of phosphate. And I have had so many people throughout the years that reference that episode and how helpful that was to them to really understand the different types of phosphate. So I'm going to go ahead and do that again. Now, when I look at it, there's 5 different types of phosphate. Now, 3 of them are actual phosphate forms, and 2 of them are calculations based on those forms. And I'm going to go ahead now and go through each one of those. The first one is orthophosphate. It is the simplest form of phosphate, and it has the chemical formula of PO4, and that's done 3 times. A lot of times it might be referred to as reactive phosphorus. Now, if you run particular tests, this is probably how the orthophosphate is defined as active phosphorus. And in my opinion, and I'm going to talk about this a lot more in the next section, this is the test that you want to run for all your phosphates. You just have to convert them to orthophosphate. But more on that in a minute. Now, the next one is polyphosphate. Now, polyphosphate is a long chain of a bunch of phosphates that are linked together in a phosphinoanhydride bond. That's my fancy chemical term. We're not going to go too much into that, but just know that that is another type of phosphate. And these are phosphates that are combined together, and they're often containing other salts and metals. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you put orthophosphate and polyphosphate together in a category, they are both inorganic phosphates. So if you add both of those together, that is called total inorganic phosphate. Make sense? Sure it does. Okay, now let's talk about the other one. The other one is organic phosphates. And yes, you guessed it, organic phosphates are phosphate groups that are bonded with other organic compounds. Now, this can be referred to as phosphonate or the incorrect term organophosphonate. Now, I use that term because there's a particular test to test for organic phosphate called organophosphonate. But I had a chemistry teacher that said that was a totally redundant and incorrect term. And that became a big pet peeve of mine back when I was talking about episode 46. Now, I want to say I've mellowed out in my old age and present day Trace. I really don't mind that so much, but I do want you to know that chemically, that's not the right way to say that, but that is the name of a particular test that we run. Now, I'm not going to talk about that test in depth, but I do talk about it in episode 46. So if you want to go back and listen to that, you can hear me bring an expert on, Chris Golden of Taylor Technologies, and he talks all about it. And we have that for you on episode 46. But I'm not going to do that today. But just know that organic phosphate is where we have the organic compounds that are bonded to that. Now, if we add orthophosphate, polyphosphate, and organic phosphate all up together, that's going to give us total phosphate. So once again, the inorganic forms of phosphate are orthophosphate and polyphosphate. And if you add those two up, that's called total inorganic phosphate. And then you have organic phosphate. And if you add that to the total inorganic phosphate, you get total phosphate. Time for a quick break, Scaling Up Nation, as we hear from one of our sponsors. Are you a water treatment professional seeking a reliable partner? Look no further than Scranton Associates. For over a century, this 100% woman-owned business has been creating solutions, not just blending products. As a fourth-generation family-owned company, Scranton Associates brings a unique perspective to your water treatment needs. Whether you require liquid blends, powdered blends, or biocides, their expert team ensures your formulations are crafted with precision and care. Experience the difference of working with a company where you always speak to a person, not a department. Visit scalinguph2o.com/Scranton and discover why professionals have trusted Scranton Associates for over 100 years. Once again, that's scalinguph2o.com/Scranton. Scranton Associates. We don't just blend, we create solutions. Let's jump back in right where we left off. Next up, we're going to talk about how to test for phosphate. And I believe there's only one real, and I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see it, phosphate test out there, and it is the orthophosphate test. In all of my experience, and I'm not saying the other tests are bad, but the orthophosphate test is the most repeatable and the most reliable test that I have ever used for phosphate. And chances are you are already using that. And that's what we are going to talk about today. Now, when it comes to orthophosphate testing, most likely you are getting your results after preparing your sample, letting it cook for however long. That's a generic term I use for just the wait time. And then you are either going to compare the color on some sort of already made color that you're going to compare it to, like a color wheel, or you're going to stick that into a meter, and that meter is going to use a wavelength. And whatever that wavelength is that's absorbed through the prepared sample and then doesn't make it to the other side, that meter will tell you in parts per million how much orthophosphate that you have. And I'm willing to bet most of us are using the latter in this day and age, but that's how that works. It's using the absorbed wavelength to figure out how much you have. So now, depending on what type of test that you use, you're going to get a different color. So I'm going to talk about my favorite ortho test, which is called the molybdenate method. And this is where orthophosphate reacts with molybdate in an acid environment to produce a mixed phosphate molybdate complex. And it is a yellow color. And then depending on how yellow that is how much phosphate is in there. And if you're curious to what your meter is doing, it is looking for 430 nanometers, and it's seeing how much gets thrown through that sample, and it's able to read it on the back end to read in parts per million. And you all have ranges that you are supposed to keep your products at in parts per million. So that's how your meter's helping you out with that. Now, why does Trace like the yellow molybdenate method? Because you actually have to do a little bit more in preparation for this method. You actually have to prepare a blank with the molybdenate. You then zero out that blank, and then you have your other sample. With some of the other tests, you still need a blank, but you don't have to do some of the prep work like you do with this. Now, if you run them side by side, there's no extra time that you need to run these. So I don't think that's a big deal. But my job is to give you all the information so you can make the best decision for you. But I still haven't told you why this is my favorite of the testing. And the reason it's my favorite is because of the range. It's 0 to 45. Well, if we look at most of our parameters in our systems, we're going to be right within that range, which means we don't have to do additional dilutions to read that final result. So now let's talk about the other test that you might be using to test orthophosphate. And that, of course, is called the ascorbic acid method. Now, Hawk specifically calls it phosphate 3, and depending on where you're getting that, there might be a different name from that. By the way, I'm going to have all of the Hawk water analysis references on our show notes page, so you can go to the show notes page and you can get all of this information. And even if you don't use Hawk, Hawk does such a good job of laying out how their instructions are, what the interferences are, how the test actually works. I encourage you to just have in your favorite links on your browser when you're looking at water treatment stuff that you have the Hawk Water Analysis Handbook there. It's not going to cost you anything. It's totally free. Some of the best procedures out there, I think, especially when you're trying to look at all the things you need to know about running a test. So again, Hawk calls their phosphate 3, and if you look that up, you will see that is where the orthophosphate reacts with molybdate in an acid environment, and it also produces the phosphate molybdenum complex, and it produces an intense blue color. Now, this color, this blue color, is in the wavelength of 880 nanometers. Now, why is this not my favorite test? Because this is the standard of orthophosphate testing. So if you need A rock solid number, this is the standard that most people are going to point you to. But the reason I don't use it on a regular basis is the range. It only goes up to 2.5 parts per million. Now, we can still use it, but what that means is we're going to have to prepare a dilution as we're testing this. And then whatever we get on our meter, we're going to have to apply a multiplier. Nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that every time we do a dilution, whenever we add something to the procedure, we're putting some sort of potential error into the procedure. So if I don't have to do that, I'd rather run the test as it is. And that's why I like the molybdenate method, because I don't have to do any dilutions. But there's nothing wrong doing a dilution provided that you do it properly. And that means everything is measured out properly. Everything that you measure in is clean because you don't want to sample yesterday's sample. You want to make sure that it is the sample that you are looking at right now. So do whatever you want to do. Just make sure that you are procedurally correct. And one of the things, again, that I'm going to recommend that you do is you learn everything you can about your tests. Now, you get to choose what test you are going to use, but what we're going to do is we are going to start testing for orthophosphate. And remember, every test we do is going to be an orthophosphate test because those were the tests that we just talked about. That means that we have to get all those forms that we talked about to the ortho form. So the very first thing that we are going to do is we are going to test for ortho. We're not going to do anything else to it. We're going to get our base number for what ortho is in that sample. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to test for polyphosphate. Now, in order to test for polyphosphate with an ortho test is we have to revert it back to the ortho form. Now, what that means is we're hydrolyzing that in an acid environment. So there's a procedure for that. You're going to follow that procedure, and then you're going to test it for ortho. But that sample is not just going to tell you how much poly is in there as ortho. It also has the original ortho that was already in that sample, which is why you've got to subtract the original ortho. And when you do that, you now know how much polyphosphate you have in that system. Now, if you didn't subtract that out, you have total inorganic phosphate. So there you go. That's pretty cool. You ran 2 tests, you got 3 results there, and you know what that means now. We're going to go into it a little bit more in the next section, but now you're starting to understand, why am I running these tests? What is it actually doing? And now you're getting that information. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to test for organic phosphate. And you're probably saying, Trace, I have a special test for that. I don't have to revert it. And it's not reverting when we talk about the organic form. We actually use the term degrading. So we degrade organic phosphate to orthophosphate. And as I said, ortho is the only true test for phosphate. Now, there are some other tests out there that will test for organic phosphate. I personally have some issues with their repeatability. If you're able to use those and use those well, you are fine to use whatever test that you want. Just make sure you understand everything about your test so you understand everything about your results. That being said, my preference is to use the ortho test when running organic phosphate. Now, what we're doing in this test is we are actually digesting the sample, and we're doing that with either ultraviolet light or we're using heat, both in the presence of the abundance of oxygen. So we're then converting that to the ortho form. We are going to then run orthophosphate testing on that. And then what we have in that sample is we have the organic phosphate that has degraded to orthophosphate plus the original orthophosphate that we started with. So we have to subtract that number out, and that gives us organic phosphate. Now, if you want to test all phosphate together, you can actually do it all in one sample, but you have to use the heat method. You're not going to be able to use the UV light with this. You then put your reagent in to add the abundance of oxygen, and normally these tests have persulfate in there. You add that, and then you heat it up, and now not only are you degrading the organic phosphate, you are also reverting the polyphosphate to orthophosphate. And now you have total phosphate all in one flask, all in one test. Now, the reason that you would want to subtract things out is you know what in your sample is in the ortho form, what's in the poly form. Add those together, you'll get inorganic phosphate, the total inorganic phosphate. And then in order to get organic phosphate, you would subtract out the original ortho that you tested for. And then you add total inorganic up and whatever you got in your organic, and that is total phosphate, all from one test. And yes, it is important you know all of those things because all of those things are in your products. Now, something you might want to do is look at your product data sheets, see what types of phosphates that you have in your products, and then figure out, okay, is that an ortho? Is that a poly? Is that an organic? Why did our chemist put those in there? What is it doing in the system? And now, how much of each form do I need to maintain in the system? And here's the big question, why? Folks, if you understand that, not only are you running your tests properly, you're interpreting them to your products. And that is the whole reason for running our tests. So I hope that that helps you look at phosphate in a totally new light. And with that, I also hope you go back and you listen to episode 46, because I didn't cover everything in this episode that I covered there. But one thing I do want to talk about in episode 46 is that SteriPen. Now, I mentioned that in the top of the show. The SteriPen is just a UV light. And we have found that it is an off-counter use because it's used in the hiking industry to sterilize water you might get out of a lake, river, or stream, so you can drink it along the way without pathogenic biologicals being in there and making yourself sick. So that's why it was developed. And Chris Golden of Taylor Technologies found out that you could use this instead of another UV light. And we tested that so many different ways here in my company. And I actually share with you how we figured out, are you able to get repeatable results? What did we actually do for that? So all of that is on episode 46, and you can hear Chris come in and talk to us about that and how his team helped develop their procedures using the SteriPen. Now, I will say that since that episode aired, there is a new SteriPen that has come out. It is a rechargeable SteriPen, and I do not have enough data to share that information with you right now, but we're working on it. We are testing it, and I will give you an update in the future about what I found out and how the procedures need to change. But trust me, using something like a SteriPen, making sure that you're running your test exactly the way the procedures say with the given UV device, and then knowing what that result is, and then trying another UV source like the SteriPen and getting the same result, that gives you evidence that you can run your test that way. Do it a couple of times. Make sure it is repeatable. And that's what we're trying to do with this new light source. So more to follow on that. I do want to talk about some tips with using phosphate. And I mentioned my dad throwing the calcium phosphate against the concrete wall and denting the concrete wall. I think that's a good visual to have how difficult it is to clean up in the system. So it's important to make sure we're using phosphate properly. And it's all dependent on carbonate alkalinity. Carbonate alkalinity is key when it comes to phosphate. Now, if you do a search on alkalinity, I've done a couple of shows on alkalinity, But I'm just going to go into carbonate alkalinity is the type of alkalinity that occurs above a pH of 8.3. So depending on what the pH of your system is, you are going to want to run a particular phosphate. Well, Trace, what particular phosphates are there? Well, there's inorganic phosphates and there are organic phosphates. And typically you're using an inorganic phosphate when there is the absence of carbonate alkalinity, and you are using those for corrosion inhibition. And in the presence of carbonate alkalinity, inorganic phosphates can create a tremendous amount of scale. And you just don't want to go there. That was the situation that the other vendor did with the experiment that my dad was showing me by throwing the calcium phosphate against the wall. They did not look at their water parameters. And they used a program that worked fine across the street. But because of what was going on in this system, there was carbonate alkalinity present, and they scaled up the system. And it was pretty bad. So don't be that guy. Don't do that. Now you know what to look for. So now on the inverse of that, if you do have carbonate alkalinity, which is a pH above 8.3, you're probably going to use an organic phosphate. And organic phosphates can provide corrosion inhibition and also scale inhibition. And most likely, all of your products probably have a little mix of a little bit of all of those in there to some extent or another. Go and ask your chemist, why did they do that? Or why does it not have that in there for this extremely scaling water product? You're going to learn so much by asking questions like that. Now, here's some advice that I am going to give you. Know the pH of your system water. I just mentioned some of the issues. The inorganic phosphate you do not want in the system if you have carbonate alkalinity. An abundance of carbonate alkalinity will cause excessive calcium phosphate scaling, not a good thing. If you don't have carbonate alkalinity and you're using an organic phosphate, it will not work because it needs carbonate alkalinity to do what it does. And at best, you'll get spotty corrosion protection, but you're probably not going to get the protection that you're hoping for. And spotty corrosion protection, just listen to some previous shows, in a lot of cases is worse than no protection at all. So it all starts with that carbonate alkalinity. And then I recommend that you run some stability indices on your water. And one I like to use is the Risner Stability Index. Now, you might use the Langelier Stability Index. You might use the Practical or Precorious Scaling Index. I don't care which one you use. Just make sure you use it consistently and know what it says. Number one, it says that you have either a scaling or a non-scaling water. And if you have a scaling water, especially if it's a highly scaling water, you're probably not going to want to use the inorganic phosphates. There you go. I think all that's making sense now. By the way, if you want to hear more about the stability indices, wow, we're bringing out all the old episodes today. Episode 24, I talked about LSI, RSI, and PSI. So go back and listen to that one. Maybe that's one I need to update in the future. I'll go ahead and add that to my records. The other scaling indice that I want you to run when you're running phosphate is the calcium phosphate scale indicator. And that's going to tell you how much orthophosphate you can hold in the system without creating calcium phosphate. Now, here's the caveat with that. It is considering you don't have any chemistries in the system. Now, we all know we put goodies in our products to have threshold inhibition so we can increase how much calcium we have in the system before there is an issue. So that being said, still run the scale indice, but just know it's going to be a worser case scenario. So what do you think? Do you understand phosphate a little bit better? Did you go back and listen to those earlier episodes that I mentioned? Well, I do want to encourage you to go back and listen to episode 46. And then if you want to hear about the scaling indices, that was episode 24. And I want to thank all the people that wrote in asking questions about phosphate, even if you were one of the people that didn't realize we already had an episode on phosphate. One of my favorite topics, I think one of the most misunderstood topics. I enjoyed refreshing this episode. And the only reason I got a chance to do that is because you care enough to let me know what you want to hear on that podcast. So thank you for that. I want to once again thank everybody that came up to me and said hello to me at the AWT technical training. As you know, Scaling Up Nation, that is one of my favorite things to do. Not only do I get to see so many of you, and I gave out several buttons, not quite the 20 pounds that I did at the AWT conference, but several people came up to me and asked me for a scaling up button. It's one of my favorite things to do is to give those out. And then people will post those on their social media and they'll hashtag us in on hashtag scaling up H2O. And I get to see where their button, there's this one person that will take their button on vacation with them and they'll send us pictures back. It's just so fun. So anyway, thank you for all the people that asked for buttons. Thank you for people that told me what this podcast has done for them. And I have to say, I'm very humble when it comes to that. I don't think this podcast or I did anything for you other than maybe gave you a little bit of nudge. Anything that required any sort of effort, that was all you. But I am happy that we could have given you a little bit of motivation to maybe make that easier. Nation, we're going to have a brand new episode for you next Friday. In the meantime, have a great week, folks. Struggling to prepare for the Certified Water Technologist exam? Our Certified Water Technologist prep course is here to help. Gain the confidence you need with comprehensive study materials and a 100-question practice exam. And the best part, we offer a free version to get you started. Head over to scalinguph2o.com/CWT prep and take the first step towards your certification today.